we're talking about the Saudi-Israeli normalization, the potential for that. It's hard to believe that it was only 6 weeks ago, feels like a year almost, that MBS gave this interview with Fox News' Brett Baer, in which he said that, quote, every day we get closer to this potential deal with Israel over normalization, and that he called this, quote, the biggest historical deal since the end of the Cold War. Likewise, Bibi Netanyahu was saying at the UN General Assembly that we are, quote, at the cusp of a historic agreement that's going to change the nature of the Middle East. But one of the questions we'll, of course, have to address is the extent to which the events of October 7 have derailed what seemed to be an agreement over which there was a lot of diplomatic activity, a lot of visits by Brett McGurk and others from the National Security Council and the State Department to Riyadh and Jeddah and other places, trying to get some kind of a deal done. But I think it might be helpful to kind of go back to what things were like before October 7 and get to some of the terms that were being laid out for such an agreement. And I should say, I myself, and perhaps more so than Bernie, was a bit skeptical that something like a full-scale normalization agreement was really on the horizon, was really about to be achieved. And I'll tell you why in just a few moments. It has to do with what were the 4 major Saudi demands that we kept seeing in the media. There were more demands than these, or we could say terms of an agreement if we don't want to use the term demands. But the idea was that Saudi Arabia would normalize relations a la the Abraham Accords with Israel in exchange for certain favors. One of these was going to be a kind of security guarantee for Saudi Arabia from the United States. Another was going to be a mechanism for accelerated acquisition of the most sophisticated U.S. weaponry, possibly including F-35 fighter jets. The third thing that I saw a lot was U.S. support for a civilian nuclear program to rival Iran in this way. And the fourth was, and only the fourth point had anything to do with the Palestinians. And that was some kind of Israeli concession to the Palestinians. It was sort of vague. In the interview that MBS gave, and MBS, of course, the Conference of Saudi Arabia, that he gave to Fox News, he talked about not a Palestinian state as being a condition for normalization. He talked about easing the life of the Palestinians. So you could see there that he seemed to be walking back the idea that was, the centerpiece of Saudi diplomacy with regard to the Palestinian issue, and that was something called the Arab Peace Initiative, which was brought out in 2002. The idea behind which was that in exchange for ending the occupation and allowing the creation of a Palestinian state, the Arab world would offer full recognition, full normalization with Israel. So there seemed to be a walking back of that, and these were the kind of 4 things that MBS, the Conference of Saudi Arabia, wanted. The reason I was sort of skeptical that this was really on the verge of happening was largely for political reasons in Washington and Jerusalem. So the first big obstacle, I think, was and remains this idea of a security guarantee. The Saudis want something more substantial than just being declared a major non-NATO ally, which is, I think, what a lot of us thought maybe the Saudis were after at the beginning of this process. They seem to be much more interested in something that is a kind of binding treaty that requires the United States to come to the defense of Saudi Arabia in the case of an attack. And you could see that there was significant resistance to this among certain segments of the Democratic Party. On October 4, just 3 days before October 7, there was a letter signed by 20 leading Democratic senators, an open letter to President Biden. The senator signatories included Chris Murphy, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and they were pushing back against the idea that a security guarantee for Saudi Arabia was in the U.S. national interest. They wrote, and I quote, "A high degree of proof would be required to show that a binding defense treaty with Saudi Arabia aligns with U.S. interests." So it's not clear to me how President Biden was going to get 67 U.S. senators to endorse a treaty. However, murky the language could have been, that sort of maybe requires the United States to support Saudi Arabia in the event of a conflict, in the event that it comes under attack. So that's one issue. The second issue for me with regard to these four big Saudi asks was the idea of an Israeli concession to the Palestinians. It's not really clear what sort of a concession that the Saudis were looking for. They were clearly looking for something that was far short of a Palestinian state. But with the makeup of the Israeli government, Bibi Netanyahu's coalition, it didn't seem like any sort of concession was really on the table. And there were members of the Israeli cabinet who were signaling quite publicly that they were not willing to give the Palestinians anything when it came to an issue to this issue of potential normalization. So that's where we were before October 7. I was already fairly skeptical. I did believe that in the long term that something would happen, that there would be a normalization. It's in the interests of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Clearly, this is something MBS wants. Just before the events of October 7, you had Israeli ministers visiting Saudi Arabia for the first time. There was a lot of movement in this direction, but there were some significant obstacles. I think that those obstacles now have grown into something that is going to make normalization something that's much more in the future. So on the very day of the Hamas attack, one thing that we saw was the Saudi Foreign Ministry kind of blaming Israel for what had happened, and they issued a statement warning that Israel's, quote, occupation, the deprivation of the Palestinian people of their legitimate rights, the repetition of systematic provocations, that is what led to this moment. And there was no, and there hasn't been any official condemnation of Hamas, none that I've seen anyway. I mean, I know that in the Saudi press that I follow, the columnists are very critical of Hamas. They consider it a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood and part of the Iranian axis, but the messaging coming out of Riyadh with regard to what's going on right now is very pro-Palestine. It's not explicitly anti-Hamas, and you're seeing a lot more references to the Arab Peace Initiative, which is essentially saying that Saudi Arabia will not normalize with Israel unless there is a Palestinian state and the occupation is over. And clearly we are not headed in that direction if you're studying what's going on right now in Israel. And furthermore, you're seeing an inflaming of anti-Israeli feeling in the entire Arab world, and that makes it all the harder for MBS to push for normalization at this time. And who knows when those feelings will subside, especially if we are entering a stage of renewed Israeli occupation of Gaza. So that's sort of where I am now. I think that it's not all doom and gloom. I think that we are still sort of headed in the right direction, and I don't think that this will permanently derail things, but we have some significant obstacles. The positives are, I think, that we've really moved on, that Saudi society has really, really moved on from what was a kind of atmosphere of toxic anti-Semitism that was, that infused the whole society from the leadership down. I mean, it was King Faisal in the 1960s. You see this anecdote repeated all the time, that he used to provide visiting delegations to Saudi Arabia with copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And he thought that this was a great book that was, that explained what was going on in Israel. I remember when I first went to Riyadh in 2013, was hosted by the King Faisal Center. There was a lone book in my office, just one book. It was called the Saudi Military in Palestine, a celebration of the Saudi military adventure in 1948. I don't know, it didn't really accomplish anything, but kind of revealing was, and this was a book that was originally written in the 1950s and was republished in 2002 by basically a wing of the Saudi government, the King Abdul Aziz Foundation. And the introduction describes, I guess I didn't underline the words, it describes Palestine as the issue of greatest priority for Saudi Arabia from 1948 to the present, and that it says that will never change. Clearly, something has changed, and I think it's going to continue to change, but there are these obstacles that make it difficult. And with that, who wants to go next?
Okay. I hope you can hear me. So let me, as a historian, provide some sort of background to the Saudi-Israeli relationship and also the Saudi-U.S. relationship, which is inextricable to how Saudi Arabia thinks about Israel. So a couple of kind of basic points. First, Saudi Arabia has always wanted to be deemed and regarded as a strategic ally of the United States. This is a demand that it has been making since the 1960s of the United States. And essentially wasn't able to get it. And this is one of the principal aims of the present Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is to have the U.S. both acknowledge but also implement structurally a relationship that is deemed strategic between both countries. Then after the 1973 war, if you follow the U.S.-Saudi relationship, you'll notice that very soon after the oil embargo, the Saudis did several things with the United States that formed the basis of a very strong relationship. I'll just name a few things that the Saudis and the Americans agreed to. One is the recycling of petrodollars, so that the Saudis were buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. Treasury bills from the United States. This was a secret agreement. The U.S. was not to reveal how much money the Saudis were putting into the U.S. economy. There's a whole story about the recycling of petrodollars in a book by a man called David Spiro that I would encourage you to read if you want to know about that special relationship. The Saudis also, in addition to recycling their petrodollars, after the Church Committee report, which banned the CIA from spending on anti-communist movements around the world, the Saudis came up with an agreement with French intelligence and other intelligence services to essentially foot the bill that the CIA was no longer able to pay for, and they funded lots of things around the world. Then, of course, the relationship further kind of solidified, where the Saudis would pump more, produce more oil. In the case of any disruption in the oil markets, the most important example of this was the 1979 Iran Revolution, where something like close to 3 to 4 million barrels of Iranian production was lost. The Saudis immediately came up with much of that difference in terms of their own production. And then there was the alliance in the war against the Soviets, who had invaded Afghanistan, the Carter Doctrine, the corollary to the Carter Doctrine with Reagan. So the relationship has been, quite strong. Then, of course, the most important probably moment that tested the relationship was after that was the 1990 August 2nd invasion by Iraq of Kuwait, when the U.S., without a defense agreement with the Saudis, sent 500,000 troops and mobilized, the largest sort of military force until then across to defend Saudi Arabia, and did so very effectively. The relationship was again tested after 9/11, during and after 9/11, and then that was patched up with a very tight relationship with the intelligence and security services of both countries to fight Al-Qaeda, a fight that was, and then the Islamic State, where the two countries were very strongly allied. So, the relationship is one that has been kind of incrementally building towards, what the Saudis are calling a strategic alliance. So that's a bit by way of background. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that Saudi Arabia, with the accession to the throne of King Salman in January 2015 and the effective power being handed to his son, Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, has shifted, and this was not obvious, by the way, when King Salman became king, shifted away from a policy of supporting both Islam and Islamism as the foundation for the regime's legitimacy towards something more or much more intensely focused on nationalism and a certain set of policies of social liberalization, especially when it comes to revising the educational curriculum, empowering women, and a number of other things that they're doing. And this was also a recognition by the Crown Prince that the majority of the population is under the age of 30. The majority of the population, this youth bulge in Saudi Arabia, is not very political or politicized. People who really care about Arab nationalist or questions of Palestine and so on tend to be the older generation. The younger don't care. They're much more focused on other things, most importantly now nationalism, which is being fostered by the government. And so under the aegis of this new orientation towards nationalism, Saudi Arabia was very keen and is very keen to accomplish finally, formally, this strategic alliance between the kingdom and the United States. And it's with this deep desire, which has been around since the 1960s, if not earlier, that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has been pushing for this alliance, and he saw two avenues for accomplishing this. One was the normalization, i.e., making peace with Israel, as a way to get the United States to give him this formal treaty. The other is to play footsie with the Chinese, and to get the Americans to realize that if they did not come up with the goods on, with the strategic alliance, that there were other options that Saudi Arabia could pursue. And this became most apparent when a détente agreement, a very minimal agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran was made under the or using the good offices of the Chinese, of Beijing. And this alerted the Biden administration that something was up in the Gulf, and something that could be profoundly threatening to core U.S. strategic interests. So that's the kind of some of the background. The other bit of the background that you need to know for understanding what's been happening, and especially the kind of volte-face, the kind of about turn of the Biden administration vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, going from calling the Saudis pariah state, issuing or releasing a CIA document that doesn't prove but sort of strongly alleges that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was implicated and responsible for the murder of the Saudi dissident Jamal Khashoggi. And also, the third thing that the Biden administration did very soon after coming to office was to declare or to remove the U.S. declaration of the Houthi movement as a terrorist movement, and to basically call them not terrorists, which is, of course, exactly what they are. So those were all three slaps in the face of the Saudi Crown Prince, and it looked like Biden was going to pursue this policy through his administration and return to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal agreement, with the appointment of someone like Rob Malley as the special envoy to Iran. And something happened in the world, which is COVID, and then we were coming out of COVID in the fall of 2021, and the gasoline prices at the pump were extremely high. I'm not going to talk for much longer because I don't like hogging the microphone, and I desperately want to hear our third colleague speak. But I'll just end with some of what I just want to say about the Biden administration. So, if you remember, in the fall 2021, we were coming out of COVID, and the gasoline prices were very, very high. They had hit $7 to the gallon in California, and all U.S. presidents are extremely sensitive to gasoline prices, especially when midterm elections were just around the corner, less than a year away in November 2022. And so the U.S. president sends his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, to Saudi Arabia and meets with the crown, this person meets with the crown prince, and essentially says something about Jamal Khashoggi and so on, which upsets the crown prince, but then also asks for increased oil production by Saudi Arabia to bring the price of oil down. This is 5 or 6 months before Russia invades the Ukraine in February, if I'm not mistaken, of 2022. To which the Saudis smile. Saudi Crown Prince smiles to Jake Sullivan and, makes polite noises, which the Americans have always confused as meaning yes when the Saudis do this. Arabs always smile and are polite, especially Saudis. And the Americans have invariably always misunderstood the signal of politeness. Of course, Saudi Arabia did not increase production then. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine happens, and the price of oil really then goes up, and there's this fear of a major disruption in the international oil markets. And so Saudi Arabia all of a sudden becomes extremely important in the political analyses and calculations of the Biden administration, which ultimately then leads to a visit of the President of the United States in July of 2022 to Jeddah to meet the MBS, the famous sort of fist bump. But essentially, that meeting was the Emperor of Rome, the President of the United States, coming to kiss the ring of the world's most important oil producer. Though the United States actually produces double the amount of oil as Saudi Arabia, what the United States doesn't have, and Saudi Arabia has, is what is called, in the oil business, spare capacity. And that is what makes you powerful in the oil market, which means it's the capacity to be able to increase production in the case of a shortage of supply, and that is something that the kingdom has. So the Biden administration again asks for an increase in oil supply, this time ostensibly not for electoral purposes because of the November midterm elections, but rather because of the disruption caused by the Russian invasion. Again, the Saudis make polite noises. I think they increased the production by 100,000 barrels, which is a piss in the bucket. And the Biden administration is very upset, and then they go on to meet, OPEC Plus meets, and Saudi Arabia decides to cut production. And that really then pisses off the Biden administration, thinking that this is going to be terrible for the midterm elections. There's going to be this red wave of Republican victories, which in fact doesn't materialize. And the Biden administration at the time makes noises about reevaluating, reassessing the nature of the relationship with Saudi Arabia and so on. But given that the red wave doesn't happen during the midterm elections of 2022, the Biden administration, and then the Saudis bring the Chinese on board by the end of that year with a visit by President Xi to Saudi Arabia, the Biden administration does a complete about turn and says, okay, how can we fix this? And the way they decided to fix the relationship was to do what is, this grand sort of bargain. The U.S. would ask Saudi Arabia to stop its strategic relationship with the Chinese. The Chinese are not to build any bases in Arabia, naval bases, or any other military bases. The Saudis are not to buy major kind of military platforms and equipment from the Chinese. And the Saudis would remain committed to the dollar as the currency for oil trade, which is important for the status of the dollar as the reserve currency, the international reserve currency. And in return, the Saudis asked the Americans for several things. In fact, they asked them for 6 things, one of which had to do with Israel. The other 5 had to do with the United States. The first was that the U.S. would officially announce and declare that Saudi Arabia is a strategic ally. So it's a kind of symbolic thing. Second would be the security agreement that Cole talked about, which is sort of not quite Article 5, but more like Japan or South Korea type protection. The third would be a nuclear, civilian nuclear power plants in the kingdom, with the possibility of also enriching uranium, because Saudis are convinced they have large uranium deposits in the kingdom under American supervision and control. The fourth was the streamlined NATO-like sales agreement of weapon systems. The Saudis are actually not interested in the F-35 for reasons that I can get into if you want to in the Q&A. They would never buy and will never buy the F-35. They're interested in another system. But they want a more streamlined sale of military equipment from the U.S. that isn't constantly sort of blocked in Congress. And lastly, they want a free trade agreement with the United States. If you want to read about all of this, Cole has, and I and others at Hoover have published a special issue of Caravan, the magazine of the Hoover Institute, that has articles about all of this. What they wanted from Israel was a 2-year, an announcement that Israel would freeze settlements for 2 years. So it's more than what the UAE got, which was a 6-month freeze on annexation. It's always important to think of Saudi Arabia in light of the UAE and other Gulf countries. They always want more than what they consider the Lilliputian states of the GCC as getting. And so that's what they wanted from Israel in return for also normalization. And they had a view of what normalization would look like, which was not immediate peace, but kind of a much more phased process of peace with Israel. So no Israeli tourists in Saudi Arabia, for example. And there are a few other matters that I can talk about. So the other factor is that the Saudis don't have a lobby in the United States. The weapons manufacturing lobby is useless. The oil manufacturers are also useless. So they thought if we can get on Israel's good side, then pro-Israel folks in the United States, whether they're evangelical Christians or Jews or others, would now become our lobby. And so that's the other element of the Israel connection. And that's what was pushing them. Now, given what's happened on October 7th, I think the Saudis are still committed to a normalization agreement that is tied to all these conditions and guarantees from the U.S., but that it's going to be delayed, obviously. What they would really like is for Israel to absolutely crush Hamas in the next 48 hours, if possible, and also Hezbollah. But they are under no illusion as to the nature of Hamas or the nature of Hezbollah or what Iran gets out of being a spoiler and taking advantage of the Palestinian issue in all of this. Their signaling, by the way, in their messages, are not intended for an American audience or an Israeli audience. So to expect them to put out statements that are going to appeal to Americans is silly. All politics are local. They have a local domestic constituency to think about. And what they put out in their initial statement is a statement that condemned the killing of all civilians. You should read this as meaning Israeli civilians, not just Palestinian civilians. And that they said, yes, this happened because there's a history and a context to all of this. But to expect them to come out and condemn Hamas openly or to is to basically concede to the Iranians and to Hezbollah and to the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, the effort of trying to outflank them, which is really what October 7th is also partly about, is an attempt to outflank the groups, the countries, the states in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular, that want to see stability, peace, prosperity, versus the ones that want to see chaos, misery, and death. And the Saudis stand with the former, the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas stand with the latter, and you should not confuse the two. I'll end there, and I look forward to hearing our next colleague.
Thanks. I'll try to quickly walk you through how the Saudi behavior, whatever you see now, where it comes from, and just a quick history about this. in 1949, when the armistice was called and when the British helped the Jordanians wrestle the West Bank and East Jerusalem out of the hands of Israel and keep it for the Jordanians, the Jordanians tried to annex the West Bank. And to do so, they wanted the endorsement of the Arab League. And the Arab League endorses resolutions, but not through voting, only through consensus. So if any one of the member states says no, that's automatic veto. It got shut down. So the Jordanians went to the Arab League in 1950, and they said, we want to make the West Bank and East Jerusalem part of Jordan. And the Saudis said no. And they shut down that proposal on the assumption that this will be some sort of Palestinian state in the future. Now, the reason why the Saudis said no was because at the time, the Hashemites of Jordan and Iraq were their rivals. The Saudis were the ones who kicked the Hashemites out of Hijaz and took the kingdom of the Hashemites. So at the time, this rivalry was still strong, and the Saudis acted out of their own interest and own policy. Then fast forward 14 years after that. You go to 1964, and you have a conference held in East Jerusalem under the Jordanian auspices, where Ahmad Shuqairi, who was the Palestinian leader, who was very close with Nasser of Egypt, where they announced that they will declare the Palestinian state in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip as an independent state, and from there they will wage a war to win the rest of the land. And the Saudis said no, which is the opposite of the first no, but this is a different no. And the reason why they said no was because at the time, Shuqairi was in Nasser's pocket, and the Saudis were fighting with Nasser in Yemen, in the Yemen war. So they didn't want Nasser to win a free prize by getting an independent Palestinian state. So the Saudis, all throughout, if you observe the way they deal with all of this, is out of their self-interest first. That dictates how they work. So after Nasser lost the 1967 war, the 1967 war was the declaration that the army-to-army wars between the Arabs and the Israelis has come to its end. And Nasser stands and he declares the war of attrition, and he starts sponsoring militias and cross-border attacks from Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, and within Israel, just attack civilians, attack whoever you can attack. So when things started going toward a militia, again, the Saudis had no interest in seeing militias just mushrooming everywhere. So now the Saudis were pushing toward a state. And the Saudis thought that the best way to counter militias is to try to create a Palestinian government, even one in exile. And in 1969, they formed the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries. And the OIC is the one that came up with the idea of the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And the OIC, the Islamic bloc, put it forward in 1974 before the UN General Assembly and got approval for this designation of PLO as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And the Saudi fingerprints were all over this. And Arafat was being propped up through the Saudi oil minister, Zaki al-Yamani, at the time. He was being pushed up as the counterweight of all these military factions, PFLP, DFLP, any soup of acronym that you can put together, all these factions throughout Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. The Saudis were pushing for a state. They, in their minds, states were the solution, not the militia warfare. So this will go on with the Saudis for a long time. And after the 1973 war, the first time the Arabs and the Israelis talked face-to-face, because before that, whenever they talked to one another, including at the London Conference in 1939, they demanded that they never sit face-to-face with the Israelis. There's always some sort of diplomacy. They sit in two separate rooms. So the first time they sat face-to-face, December 1974, right after, December 1973, excuse me, right after the 1973 war, the Jordanians, the Egyptians were there. And the Saudis endorsed that idea, even though not publicly. And now we have declassified documents that assure us that the Saudis supported Sadat, they supported peace, they supported the idea of sharing the land with the Israelis, just getting a part of the land that's Palestine, another part of the land that was Israel. And they tried to push that, and they tried to make Arafat, to pin this thing on Arafat, to make Arafat endorse this. And the first time they proposed what now we call as the Arab Peace Initiative was in Morocco at the Arab League Summit, 1981 in Fas in Morocco. And it got shut down, and Arafat never stepped up. Arafat never said, yes, I'll take this. So the Saudis withdrew, and they got angry at Arafat. And then they came back again in 1982. 1982, things had changed. Israel was inside of Lebanon. The Iraqis were taking a beating from the Iranians. The Syrians were going crazier. So in 1982, they managed to get this thing endorsed. So the whole thinking of the Saudis is to not let militias handle this thing. And after Nasser was gone, we know that it was the Iranian regime that took over, and now the Iranian regime is the one that's handling all these militias, all sorts of terrorism. And the Saudis are still the ones who are pushing the state solution, the diplomacy, government to government, peace talks. So this is the Saudi thinking and the Saudi behavior. And the reason why they push this is that in their understanding, a government is always better than a militia. If the militias mushroom everywhere, that'll hurt their own interest. And this showed in the most recent Yemen war, when the Houthis toppled the government and took over Yemen, the Saudis were forced to act to try to restore the government instead of the militia. So this is an intrinsic Saudi interest in this. The Saudis are really interested in not seeing Hamas and Hezbollah, DFLP, all these other guys, Islamic Jihad, running the show. Now, with this in mind, the Saudi interest, by the time MBS made it to power, the Saudi self-perception was changing. And it was changing in a way that all throughout the Saudis could afford to have their foreign policy separate from their economic policy. They had enough oil to go around. But now the revenue from the oil was roughly the same, but the population was exploding. And MBS was too smart to notice that we can't rely on oil. We have to diversify. We have to transform the economy from one that depends on oil rent to one that depends on services economy. We have to capture a piece of the global knowledge economy pie. That's MBS's thinking. And to do that, you have to align your foreign policy with your economic policy. So all of what MBS has been doing since he came to power has been to steer Saudi Arabia in the best economic direction. And to do that, war is not good for you. Being at war with an economy that's the third or fourth biggest economy in the region, like Israel. It's roughly the size of the UAE. They both have 10 million population, 400 billion GDP. They're the third after Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So this is a big economy, dynamic economy. It has top-notch technology sector and universities. And there is a Saudi interest in having peace with this economy. If you are the manager of Procter & Gamble and you want to open your regional office, you'll open it in the UAE because the UAE talks to everyone, including to Israel. You wouldn't open it in Saudi Arabia if Saudi Arabia is not open, does not have access to something like Israel. So most of what you see is out of Saudi interest. And this is what I've been trying to explain ever since this whole drive to normalization started. I read many Israeli columnists. I listen to Israeli friends, and their thinking is that if Saudi Arabia signs this peace treaty with Israel, that'll be the peace to end all peace. That everyone will come on board. From Indonesia to Malaysia to everyone who's in the OIC will come on board. I don't think that'll happen. I think what you will get is the Saudis themselves coming under the slogan that MBS raised, Saudi first. So they will come, Saudi Arabia only. I don't think they'll even come. I don't think they'll even bring the closest allies, even Kuwait, which is the closest ally of Saudi Arabia in the region. I don't think the Kuwaitis will come and sign peace if the Saudis sign peace. That's my own prediction. So the Saudis are coming on their own. They will not handle Al-Aqsa as being, the custodians of the two holiest mosques of Islam. They're not interested in adding the third site to their portfolio. They're coming on their own. But the way that they're coming, they want to try to give Palestinians a chance. They're telling them, listen, we're going to peace whether you like it or not. You either hop on and get a peace or you don't. And from what we saw happen, we saw Hussain al-Sheikh, the number 2 in the Palestinian Authority, visit Saudi Arabia. And you can see that the Palestinians were not asking for 2 states. They were not asking for specific. They asked for a couple of ideas that were roughly abstract. So the recognition of Palestine as a full member at the UN. Now, I'm not sure what they get out of it. I'm pretty sure that they have some sort of calculus in their heads, but that's not exactly the full 2-state solution that we read in the statements of the Saudi Foreign Ministry. So my last point here is that since October 7, I've been happy to see that MBS himself, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, at least at 3 occasions, he has said that once this war is over, we will go back to where we stopped on October 6th in terms of normalization. He told this to a CODEL delegation headed by Senator Lindsey Graham, who visited Saudi Arabia last week. He told this to President Biden in a phone conversation between the two. And I think he totally understands that what happened because Iran and Hamas were trying to undermine this normalization. And we have Iranian officials on the record saying this. We have the top foreign policy advisor to Ali Khamenei. His name is Ali Akbar Wilayati. He was a former foreign minister of Iran. He called the foreign minister of Syria, and he outlined why this war happened. This call happened on October 9. And he told his Syrian friend, there are some governments in the region that don't understand the sensitivity, that are trying to build corridors through the region. And they don't understand the sensitivity of this, and they're wrong, because their regimes will collapse if they continue doing this and normalize. Now, the corridors is the Indian, Middle East, European corridor, IMEC, that was announced in September 9. So the Iranians know what they're doing, and Hamas is stepping up to do the Iranian bidding. And anyone in this room who knows the history of Hamas, we know that throughout the 1990s, whenever anyone was talking peace, Hamas was making sure to thwart the peace, to suicide bomb the peace, to kill as many Israelis as they could to derail the peace. Thank you.